As a starting point for answering that question, I'd like to give you a little puzzle to think about. Imagine that you had collected data on a whole bunch of different industries, maybe 20 or 30 different industries. And for each industry, you gathered two basic bits of information. First, you got information on the average profitability of the companies competing in that industry. How profitable, on average, were the companies that competed in that particular industry? Second, you also got information on the level of market concentration in that industry. How much was that industry and that market dominated by the few largest competitors in the industry? And imagine that you plotted all of that data as a scatter plot of points on this graph, with each industry being 1 point on the graph. Now, if market concentration were truly the only factor affecting the profitability of an industry, then what sort of pattern would you expect to see in the points that you plot on this graph? You'd expect to see something like this: an upward sloping pattern of points with industry profitability increasing as market concentration increases. That's what you would expect to see if market concentration were the only factor affecting industry profitability. So that's what we would expect to see on that graph. But when we draw a real graph with the real numbers, what do we actually see? This is what we actually see. This graph shows industry concentration versus industry profitability in 24 U.S. manufacturing industries for 1992. The horizontal axis shows the 8-firm concentration ratio, which is just a fancy way of saying what was the combined market share of the 8 largest companies competing in the industry. And the vertical axis shows the industry's median return on sales. So, what we see in this graph is certainly not what we expected to see. It's not the tightly focused upward sloping scatterplot pattern of points that we said we would expect to see if industry concentration were the only factor affecting profitability. And so we can ask, why is this graph different? What are we missing? And I'd like you to think about that. Why are we not seeing the pattern that we would have expected to see if industry concentration were the only factor? Well, let me give you a few hints. First, as we said a moment ago, if industry concentration were the only factor affecting profitability, then we would expect to see a tightly focused pattern of points from the lower left up to the upper right, upward sloping from the lower left up to the upper right. And therefore, we should not expect to see any points in the upper left or any points in the lower right. So those points that do exist on this graph in the upper left and the lower right are anomalies. They're aberrations if concentration were the only factor affecting profitability. So let's take a closer look at those anomalies, those aberrations, those points that shouldn't be on this graph if industry concentration were the only factor affecting industry profitability. Let's take a look at those points. In the upper left, we have book publishing and process control instruments. In the lower right, we have flour and alkalis and chlorine. So these 4 points are 4 points that, again, if concentration were the only factor, those points shouldn't be there. Certainly concentration does not explain the difference between the profitability of these 4 points, right? Because we would expect higher concentration to generate higher profitability. And yet, the highest profitability industries that we see among these 4 industries are the ones with the lowest concentration ratio. So clearly, concentration is not explaining the difference in profitability between these 4 industries. So my question is, what other difference must there be between these 4 industries that explains their performance difference? Because certainly, concentration is not doing it. What I'd like you to do now is take a few moments, maybe 20 or 30 seconds, to jot down your thoughts. What factors might explain the differences in the performance and the profitability of these 2 sets of industries, because concentration is not explaining it? What might be the differences between book publishing and process control instruments on the one hand, and flour and alkalis and chlorine on the other hand, that might explain the performance difference of those 2 sets of industries? Take a moment now to think about it and write down a few answers. Some of the factors you may have thought of might include things like product differentiation. There certainly would appear to be great differences in the differentiability of the product across these different industries. Book publishing would produce a very highly differentiated product, as would process control instruments, whereas flour and alkalis and chlorine are commodity industries where there would be very little differentiability possible across companies in the industry. Likewise, you may also have thought about switching costs. Once a customer buys process control instruments from one particular supplier, there may be costs to switching over to a different supplier when buying future process control instruments. There may be equipment compatibility issues. There may be learning difficulties. Once you've learned how to use the equipment from one company, it may be difficult to switch over and relearn how to use equipment from a different company, for example. Whereas there are no such switching costs in flour or in alkalis and chlorine. Those are commodity products, and you can buy flour from company A one day and from company B the next day. And the same with alkalis and chlorine. You may also have thought about things like control over distribution channels or proprietary knowledge and technology. You might think that, for example, there's quite a bit more proprietary knowledge and technology in book publishing and in process control instruments, where intellectual property would be very important in both of those industries. The copyrights over particular books and the rights to the work of particular publishers in book publishing, and the particular knowledge or technology that goes into a type of process control instruments. Those sort of intellectual property issues are likely to be less pressing in an industry like flour or alkalis and chlorine. You might also have thought about the concentration of buyers versus firms in the industry, or concentration of suppliers versus firms in the industry, or things like the industry growth rate. Many different factors beyond the concentration ratio of the particular industry could affect the profitability in such a way as to increase the profitability of highly unconcentrated industries like book publishing and process control instruments, while at the same time dampening the profitability of highly concentrated industries like flour or alkalis and chlorine. So what do we learn from not seeing the graph that we expected to see? Well, first we learn that market concentration may not be the only factor driving the intensity of price competition. And second, we also learn that the intensity of price competition may not be the only driver of industry profitability. And so the logical questions to ask are, other than market concentration, what else drives the intensity of price competition? And also, other than the intensity of price competition, what else drives industry profitability? The answers to these two questions are the focus of industry analysis. Industry analysis is the tool that we will use to begin to answer both of these questions. Before we move on, let's take a moment to see how this topic, industry analysis, fits into the overall scheme of the course. Well, we've started the course with a focus on strategy formulation. And within strategy formulation, we've started with a focus on external analysis, the factors outside the firm, in the firm's environment, that can affect its performance. And we've already seen how competitor dynamics can affect the performance of a firm. And in fact, it's competitor dynamics that makes market concentration such an important factor. But now we're moving on to other factors beyond just competitor dynamics and market concentration that can affect the firm's performance from outside the firm, other external factors that can affect the firm's performance beyond just competitor dynamics and market concentration. And that's where we're looking at what we call industry analysis. The main conceptual tool that we will use for industry analysis in this course is Porter's 5-Force Framework. Basically, Porter's 5-Force Framework says that the average profitability of a market or industry should be determined by the strength of 5 threats to the profitability of that market or industry. The rivalry among the current competitors in the industry, the threat of new competitors entering the industry, the threat of substitute products or services produced by other industries, and the bargaining power of the industry's suppliers and the industry's customers. Now, one of the things that the 5-Force model does for us is it's an invitation to broaden our definition of competition. Typically, when you ask managers who is their competition, they will focus in on that center box, that middle box, the rivalry among the current competitors in the industry. When you ask them who is your competition, they will point to other similar companies to themselves, similar in the sense that they produce a similar product and sell it to similar customers. And yet this five-force framework encourages us to think more broadly about the set of economic actors in the firm's environment whose interests are in conflict with the firm. Yes, the current competitors who are in the industry, the similar companies to yourself, producing a similar product and selling it to similar customers, those are economic actors whose interests are in conflict with your own. Absolutely. But there's a much larger set of other economic actors whose interests are in conflict with your own. And this framework gives us sort of a checklist of who are those other economic actors and how can they affect your profitability of you in your industry. So you can think about new competitors, other companies that are outside your industry that might threaten to enter your industry as economic actors whose interests are in conflict with your own. Just like existing competitors' interests are in conflict with your own. You can think about substitute products and substitute services produced by other industries as being produced by companies whose economic interests are in conflict with your own. And you can certainly think about your suppliers and your customers as being economic actors whose interests are in conflict with your own, very directly, because those suppliers, they would like to sell you their product at a higher price, and you would like to buy it from them at a lower price. So very directly, your interests are in conflict there. And customers the same way. Those customers would like to buy your product at a lower price, and you would like to sell it to them at a higher price. And so there again, your interests are in direct conflict with each other. And so what the five-force framework does is encourages us to think more broadly about the profit pie, the total profit pie. If there is a pool or a pie of profit out there to be divided that's up for grabs, it encourages us to think about more broadly about the set of actors with whom we are in competition for a slice of that pie. Yes, we are, of course, in competition with the current competitors in the industry, those similar companies producing a similar product and selling it to similar customers. But we are also in competition for a slice of that pie with our customers, with our suppliers, with new competitors that might threaten to enter the industry, and with the producers of substitute products and services in other industries. As we said a few moments ago, market concentration is an important factor driving the overall profitability of an industry. But it's not the only factor. We've already seen that with our little scatter plot exercise, where we saw in the comparison of those industries, book publishing and flour and alkalis and chlorine and process control instruments. We've already seen in that exercise that market concentration is not the only factor. So one of the things we learned from that exercise, from not seeing the scatter plot that we expected, is that there are more forces threatening profitability of an industry than just rivalry among current competitors in the industry. If it were just the rivalry among the current competitors in the industry, then we would expect market concentration to play a much larger role in determining the overall profitability of an industry. But we've already seen in our little scatterplot exercise that that's not the case. And what that indicates to us, what we should learn from that scatterplot exercise, is it's not just the rivalry among the current competitors in the industry. There are these four other forces that do play a role in driving the profitability of the industry. And that's why it's important to broaden our notion, to broaden our definition of competition, and to think about the broader set of economic actors in the firm's environment who pose a threat to our profitability, whose interests are in conflict with our own. And that's one of the main goals and benefits of Porter's five-force framework. Next, let's examine the specific factors that can increase or decrease the strength of these five competitive forces, starting with the threat of new entrants.